you know.
Hey everyone, this is Jan, and I'm joined by Tony Perez today, who I've been following for quite a while. Tony is the co founder and CEO of Sucuri.net, a cloud based or a provider for cloud based security services, and I'm really glad he joined me. Welcome.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
You're so welcome. I'm a fan of Sucuri right when I started using WordPress because I tried your services several times, and actually it was really fun also to read your blog posts on how you do your WordPress security stuff.
Yeah.
So why is WordPress security so important when we're using WordPress?
Well, I think that security in general is very important, right? I think that we always have to be thinking about our overall posture and thinking about how people can abuse it. Um, WordPress security is very important because it's been so widely adopted. One of the things that's always made WordPress great is its flexibility and extensibility, and that's why people love the platform. That's why so many people adopt it. That's why large organizations are being forced into it by their functional areas. Um, and so when you have something that grows in popularity like this, just as many people as there are that want to do good with it, there are just as many that want to do bad with it. Um, there's always going to be people that are lazy, looking to take advantage or abuse something that you've done. And so a lot of day-to-day WordPress users or developers don't really necessarily think like that because by nature they're not malicious, right? They're
Yeah.
just kind of like, oh, I'm doing something awesome. Nobody would ever want to break my stuff. I only want to blog about cats or cupcakes or whatever the case may be.
I only have 50 visitors a day. Who should break
I
my
don't,
site? Yeah.
that's exactly right, but the thing that they have to understand is that there is no there really is no preference, right? A lot of these attacks that are occurring are automated. So the minute a website gets online, it gets crawled over a period of time, and it only takes maybe a month or two before it's found. I've created a couple honeypots myself or websites that just sit out there, and it usually takes anywhere between 30 to 45 days before the crawlers find them. They identify IP ranges for hosts, and they just continuously crawl them for new sites.
Yeah.
Once those sites are identified, then they just add them to the list, and they're none the wiser. They just add it to their networks of websites. So um, people need to understand that getting online and having an online presence comes with a large number of responsibilities. Um, just as if you get a car and you know that you have to change the oil and then you have to get gas and then you have to wash the car and then you have to check the tire pressure and you have to check the tires. There's a responsibility with owning a vehicle. You have to pay your registration depending where you are in the world, right? Your state, your country, whatever it may be, has to pay some fee. Um, and a lot of people perceive the web to be kind of this wild west where, oh, I just put it up and forget it. And it unfortunately isn't like that. And um, when they think that way is usually when they get their websites abused. And what I've learned is that a lot of website owners will talk to developers and designers and they'll say, oh, I don't need sustainment. I don't need maintenance. I don't need security. I just want to get it up and running. And what they're not thinking about is what happens 6 months down the road? What happens 12 months down the road? And while when they first deploy the site, they may not be thinking about those implications, I can tell you from experience that once they get compromised, once they're out of date, once they no longer have a feature, the value of that service becomes very, very important fast. All of
Yeah.
a sudden, it's I need it and I need it yesterday.
Yeah.
And when if they would have just thought about it up front, they would have saved themselves that headache. And it's not just security; it's everything from basic maintenance and sustainment, right? Management of the theme, upgrades, the configuration of plugins, things like that. They don't. We as experts in our respective domains, whether it's developers, designers, security professionals, we have a responsibility to educate these new website owners because these new website owners, um, they lack a lot of fundamental knowledge around the basics of how the internet works, and the basics of how websites works and what they've seen large organizations have that spent millions of dollars on either sustainment, maintenance, or security for pennies, and
Yeah.
that's usually where they go wrong. So that's why I think that, um, I guess security, maintenance, sustainment, all those facets are very responsible and or necessary in for websites.
Awesome breakdown.
A bit of a tangent there, but yeah.
Yeah, but you're right on the spot here. So when I talk to my web design clients, most of them, just like you say, they focus on the design and they focus on getting the website up. But what's after the website is up? What happens then?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
So when we're just starting our small blog about cats and kittens and stuff, what do we need to know about making our blog secure?
So I think that, I ask myself this question all the time, right? It's really easy to overwhelm the user in regards to you have to do X, Y, and Z, right? Um, and I find myself always kind of evolving my thought on this. And I think that I like to focus on two distinct things with an everyday website owner. And it's you need to focus on how you log into your environment and you need to focus on vulnerabilities. Okay. Um, One is easier to address than the other. So, for instance, if we focus all our energy in how you log in or otherwise access control, essentially when you go to WP admin,
Yeah.
um, how are you logging into that, right? So there's little things that you should be considering. Things like you shouldn't be using the same username and password that you would use, say, for instance, with your bank, right? You shouldn't be using the same username and password that you should be using with your social media, right? Those are very, very basic things. Um, you know, Passwords. What I like to say about passwords is use a password generator. Use something like LastPass or OnePassword.
Yeah.
Let it generate the password for you, and that'll address a lot of your issues. Try to work with a nothing less than about 14, 15 characters, and make that your default. And if you use a password generator, password manager, you never have an issue in regards to someone guessing your password.
And
Okay,
it's so easy to use. I
it's so
use
easy. It's so
LastPass
easy.
myself, and
It-
it's ridiculous.
there's just really no reason not to. And that's just talking to your website, but this talks to your overall posture as well, right? Like
Yeah.
you should use this across the board. You should change all your passwords for all your mediums to use unique passwords. Um, the second piece around that is I like to do multiple factors of authentication, right? That's really simple. That's a really simple way to cut down on brute force attempts, things like that. Things that a beginner might hear about, like, oh, someone's trying to break into my WP admin. Boom, add some multiple factors in there, and you'll be okay, right? So use a strong password configuration through a password generator. I won't even tell you use characters. Just use a password generator, no less than 15, 14 characters. You'll
Yeah.
be fine. Okay. Use a multi-factor, something like Google Authenticator. Rublon has a really nice multi-factor kind of plugin that you can install as well, and they're free. And what a multi-factor authentication does is um, once you try to log in and you type in your username and password, it'll send you an email or it'll send you a ping to your phone and ask you, hey, is this really you? And then you, as the website owner, can do that, right?
Yeah.
Um, so then you can either approve it or disapprove it. And if you approve it, the person gets in. Now, each person would be able to do that. So enable that by default for all your users. Another thing, the third thing that I would recommend for access control is keep in mind this concept of least privileged. And what least privilege says is that give people the permissions that they require to do their jobs, but no more, no less. So, for instance, um, a lot of people that make a mistake of when they deploy a website, they feel that every user has to be an administrator on the site, right? Um, I like to tell people remove all that privilege.
Yeah.
Most users will never use all the functionality that administrator has. So if you own a website and you're responsible for adding people and configuring the website after your developers deployed it, you are in essence the webmaster for that website. As a webmaster, you have a responsibility for the maintenance and the management of that site. Reduce everyone's permissions. This means you have to get familiar with how the roles and permissions work within WordPress. So you have things like administrator, editor, author, contributor, things like that. Understand what the hierarchy looks like and push everybody down, right? If they need to be an editor, great. But if they need to be an author, great. Put them there. Contributor, great. Put them there. If you don't need subscribers, remove that role, right? Don't let anybody subscribe.
Yeah.
Um, those are the three things that I would focus on from access control. So one is focus on a strong password using password generator. Focus on multi-factor authentication by using plugins like Rublon or Google Authenticator or Dual Security. There's some creative solutions out there like LaunchKey and GetClef as well that are good alternatives. Um, and then also focus on good administration, right? Employ principles like good. So that
Yeah.
would address the first bucket, which is access control. Software vulnerabilities, unfortunately, is a very different game, right? Um, the everyday webmaster, the everyday website owner is not a developer. A lot of them will enlist a developer like yourself or a designer, right? And they'll say, get me a site, get it deployed. They'll deploy it, but then in their mind, they don't know if you provided them good code or bad code. And the reality is that most developers and designers in their minds think that they have good code. And it's not it and it really it's unfair to say good versus bad code, right? Code is code.
Yeah.
Every code has some bit of insecurities in it. With enough time, somebody will find a way to abuse that code, right? Whether that even though you may be sanitizing all your inputs, sanitizing all your outputs as a developer, there's still going to be some creative mechanism that comes around with time. It's inevitable, right? So the vulnerability game is very challenging. One way to address this is enable auto updates in your WordPress website, right? That's by default. So that means when a vulnerability gets deployed or gets identified, if the plugin has auto updates in it, or if core of WordPress has auto updates enabled, they'll automatically push
Right.
a release and it'll update your environment. That's great and dandy. The problem is that auto updates only apply within core of WordPress itself. So a lot of the extensions, a lot of the plugins, a lot of the themes, things like that, don't necessarily support that for a variety of reasons. And so that makes it very difficult for website owners because they'll never review the code. They'll never understand the difference between a cross-site scripting versus a cross-site request forgery versus an RFI attack versus an object injection. Those words just don't mean anything to them. And so I think that what we need to be doing for our website owners is educating them on solutions that say, look, I'm doing everything that I possibly can to ensure that I develop the best code that I possibly can in your budget and to provide you the same functionality that you require. In doing so, you need to be looking at solutions that will proactively protect you against attacks, against vulnerabilities. Because we understand that there's two main vectors in attacks. We understand that access control is one, and that's something that they can easily mitigate. Software vulnerabilities is one that's really beyond an everyday webmaster's controls. So we could recommend things like, hey, let's deploy mod security on your server, right? But for the everyday webmaster that's using a shared environment, that'll do very little for them, right? They're not going to be able to deploy that. One, it's a shared environment. They won't have that ability to configure it.
Yeah.
The second piece is even if they're on a VPS, the overhead associated with managing that and sustaining it in a manner that keeps them current with the latest attacks is too difficult. So I think that with time, the best way to address um, website or vulnerabilities in code is one, developers and designers could start deploying auto updates so that when a vulnerability is released, they can patch it, right? Two is for website owners to start employing things like website firewalls, things that can sit in front of their site and can proactively scan all the incoming traffic to ensure that anything that's trying to um, abuse any of the existing functions or abuse things that might exist that you may be unaware of are proactively protecting them for you. Um, so that's how I would address those two main vectors.
Nice. So you mentioned that updating is very, very important.
Oh yeah.
How often do you recommend to update?
So I think the question here really becomes around the type of update, right? So for instance,
Yeah.
if we're looking at point releases or small releases, so for instance, look at core. So core, whenever they jump from like 4.1 to 4.2 to 4.3, those are often pretty good size updates. And we want to kind of do that very pragmatically. When we look at point releases like 4.1.1, 4.1.2, 4.1.3, etc., those point releases are often pretty safe. So the minute a point release is released, they're often addressing either a bug and more often a security issue. In those instances, I would apply them right away. For big point releases, that could become a little tricky, and it really depends on the size of your organization, right? So, for instance, um, mid to larger organizations really should be having a staging and a production environment in which the staging environment is where they would immediately apply the update, test everything, and then deploy it. And
Yeah.
so, depending on what that cycle looks like, would determine what your update process would look like. For an everyday blogger, in most instances, if they're using a reputable design shop, if they have a good maintenance, I would update the minute it comes out, right? We're no longer in the days of 3.0 or 2.0 where we had a lot of backwards compatibility issues. So that argument isn't necessarily there. There are still instances of white screen of death,
Yeah.
where they update and then all of a sudden the site doesn't come up. In many instances, that's pretty safe to kind of address. The one thing I would always recommend, though, is before you apply any update, you have to ensure that you have a good backup scheme in place. So whether that's on a daily basis because you blog daily, or whether it's a weekly basis because you blog a couple times a week and that's okay, right? It all depends on your individual preference around data loss. If you're okay with going a week, or if you're okay with going with a couple days worth loss of data, then great. If you put out that much content, then you need to put a backup plan in place that addresses that.